Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Beth Sandor, and this is my first time at the Tableau conference, and I feel completely overwhelmed. How many other people are here for the first time? There's a lot of people. Okay, good. I'm glad I'm not alone. Do you also feel a little overwhelmed by this? Okay, good. So I'm the principal at a national nonprofit called Community Solutions. And our mission is a lasting end to homelessness that leaves no one behind. And for the last 10 years, I have been leading large-scale change efforts to try to realize this mission as an organization and been failing a lot along that journey. And that's what I hope to share with you today, kind of where we failed and what we've learned. How many folks in the room have also failed trying to solve a complex problem and have a story that they can tell? Also, glad to know I'm among friends as we tell you this story. So here is what I hope to do today, which is tell you about how we've been failing forward since the 1990s, how a shift to real-time data in 2016 has really changed how we've approached this problem, and the results that we've gotten to date, and then where do we see the work going forward. Since 2017, we've been lucky enough to partner with the Tableau Foundation, and they've been an important part of our journey since then. And I think even more importantly, I think Tableau will be a really important part of where we go next in the work, and excited to tell you about that. So before I get started, as I said, we have a really big mission, and the journey I'm going to tell you about is also my personal journey of the evolution of my thinking. And that journey began in the 1990s when, as an organization, we deeply believed that the solution to homelessness was housing. And we built lots of that housing, and I actually managed a 416-unit building right down there in the corner with the American flag called the Prince George in Manhattan. And so we built lots of housing, and housing that worked really well for the people in it, by meaning that the people who lived there and still live there in these thousands of units that were created, their homelessness has been ended. But in the 2000s, we had to wake up to the fact that outside of those beautiful buildings were people, very vulnerable people, still sleeping on the streets and in shelters. And we decided to go ask them why. Why were they not inside our buildings or inside other projects like ours in New York City? And what we found when we asked them this question was systems and processes that were very, very difficult to navigate for anyone, let alone someone who wasn't sleeping in their own bed and didn't have the safety of a home. And so what you see up here is a picture from a process mapping workshop we facilitated with a team working on ending veteran homelessness. And each of those green magnets are steps in a process for an individual to move from the streets into permanent housing. And what we found when we mapped this process with all of the agencies that had a role to play in ending that individual's homelessness is that on average, processes like this were taking 300 days and had 47 steps. And so we had this aha moment of, oh, it's not just housing, it's systems. And we have to do process improvement and systems improvement and put the user at the center of that work. And so we undertook to launch a national effort in 2010 called the 100,000 Homes Campaign that was really focused on working with communities to know every single vulnerable person by name and redesign the systems to work for them rather than for the agencies that were in that system. And so 186 communities came into that campaign with us and got to know people like Ed Givens, who was homeless on the streets in LA for decades, and was one of those people that folks probably walked past and thought, that guy is never moving inside, he doesn't want to be housed, even if we had housing for him, he wouldn't take it. But because communities kind of suspended that myth that people like Ed didn't want to be housed and just instead said, hey, would you like to move into permanent housing? People like Ed moved very quickly into housing, and communities figured out how to redesign their process with the user at the center of it. And so over those 4 years, 186 communities housed 105,000 of the most vulnerable people in their communities. And those 105,000 people's lives were transformed in many of the same ways that you see Ed as what a radical transformation, and what amazing outcomes. And so we were very happy with the success, obviously, of that initiative. We had 105,000 people were housed. We exceeded the goal that we set. We saw communities, on average, increase their housing placement rate by 286%. We learned the power of knowing people by name and by picture to really humanize, like who are we talking about and what do they need. You see from this graph, we saw communities radically increase the percentage of the vulnerable population they were housing with the housing they had available around homelessness. But one thing didn't happen when we looked at the data, which is nobody ended homelessness. And if you go back to our mission is a lasting end to homelessness, not just that 105,000 people get housed. And so we had to take a hard look at what we were doing and ask, like, are we really ending homelessness at a population level if we did all this work? And this work, the theory really was if people could house people faster and more effectively and house the people that, but for that intervention, were never coming off the street, you would expect to see population level reductions in homelessness. And we just didn't see that. So we realized that maybe one of the things we were getting wrong is that instead of counting down to zero, we had been counting up to housing placements. And we needed to shift the way that we were thinking about what we were measuring and not just assume that if more people got housed, that would lead to fewer people experiencing homelessness. And that was, I think, a radical moment in our thinking. That insight is easier to have than to realize you are now in charge of that effort to figure that out, which is, that's me in July of 2014 as the celebrated 100,000 Homes campaign ended, and I realized I'm 8 months pregnant in this picture, that I'm about to have a baby and in charge of birthing this new effort that we are undertaking. But we did know some things. The team that sat in that room that day at a rented Airbnb with lots of beverages around the table, as you can see, we did know how to help people house people more quickly. We did know how important knowing people by name was. And we did realize that we couldn't ask communities to come with us to end homelessness without defining what it meant to end homelessness. And my guess is there are a lot of people in this room that may feel skeptical that ending homelessness is even possible. If you are one of those people, don't be shy. When you raise your hand, who feels skeptical? So part of my goal today with this presentation is maybe to have you leave here believing that it is possible to do that, to end homelessness, and that you also might see in the approach we've taken over the last couple of years, an approach that can be applied to lots of complex problems. So just something I'll check in with you after, keep an eye out for. But we did know that we had to measure and define what it meant to end homelessness. And actually, I think this picture was taken in the moment when we were trying to figure that out. The definition that we landed on back at the end of 2014 was for veterans, which is a population we knew may still come into homelessness as homeless systems were designed to end homelessness, is a functional definition. You'll notice it's not a hard zero, meaning there's zero veterans experiencing homelessness. It accounts for the idea that people are going to come in, and we need a system that can rapidly respond to that. So a community can say that they've ended veteran homelessness when the number of veterans experiencing homelessness is less than their 6-month housing placement average. Or, just an easier way to say, the number of veterans experiencing homelessness is less than the people that they can house in a routine month. So it's just saying, can you house the number of people? Have you historically been able to house the number of people in front of you? Which would give us confidence that if I became homeless as a veteran, that you have the ability, both the resources and the proven capacity to house me quickly. And so that's the definition for veteran homelessness. For chronic homelessness, which is people who are disabled, who've been homeless a very long time, so a year or more. With that population, we really felt like you could get to zero on that population because it's a function of time. It's really prioritizing the most vulnerable and making sure people aren't homeless a long time. And so for that, it's really getting to zero or under 3 in order to have communities have some flex for people who may be coming into the system for the first time that were unknown to them, maybe from another community, or 0.01% of your individual population. And that's just to account for, there are places like LA County, which is a county of 10 million, that 0.3 is very, very low, but 0.01% would be like 40 people. So functionally, what you have to do to get to a place where in a county of 10 million, you only have 40 people left experiencing chronic homelessness is almost like zero. I'm happy to answer questions about these definitions, but the point of them was really that, one, we wanted, when a community like Jacksonville, Florida said that they ended veteran homelessness, for that to mean the same thing when a community like Denver, Colorado said that they ended veteran homelessness. And we needed a way to have credibility across communities, that everyone was measuring in a simple and objective way, that we could share learning as we went, and that anyone who assessed that community, whether it was me or one of you in this audience, would get the same result. But they would look at the data and get the same result, that it wasn't a subjective definition of what it meant. So, equipped with a shared definition and really no other idea of how we were going to do this, we invited communities to apply to be part of Built for Zero. And we asked them to do just a handful of things: agree to that shared definition, agree to report monthly housing placement data, agree to use a quality improvement framework, and just agree to learn as part of a network of communities that would share that learning. 75 communities signed up to do that with us, which was very exciting. This is the team a month before we launched that effort. When I put this picture up, one, because it makes me very nostalgic. See, I'm no longer pregnant and have a little baby, but we are so happy and naive to what's coming in the next year. But I also to say, like, we were very much in startup mode. We were a group of people who were trying to figure something out with not a lot of money, and trying to use as many free tools as we could in our toolbox, and you'll see that what that looks like later on. But we were very much we knew we had to iterate and learn our way into the solution, and that was what we went into this journey equipped with. And we were equipped with Google Sheets. So this is a visualization that was because it was free and because we could control it entirely ourselves. And so this is the first visualization that was created for the communities that agreed to be part of Built for Zero. The data that we had when we started this journey, we had two pieces of data. One, in communities, they're required by federal government, if they get federal funds, to every year do a census count of the people experiencing homelessness. So just a tally on a given night in January, how many people are on the streets in the shelter. It's anonymous, it's just a count. And they have that data for many, many years. Over time, they've had that data. And we also had their housing placement data. So we worked with federal partners and other partners to create an extrapolation of that data to say, if we look back in time at how many people have come into their system over time based on that census data and their housing placement data, can we predict for the next year how many people do we expect to be homeless in this community the next year? And therefore, how many people every single month would they have to house to get to zero in the next year or 2 years? So we created monthly housing placement targets based on that extrapolation and said, okay, you've got 1,000 people who you need to house in the next 2 years. Let's divide that by 24 months. Here's how many people you need to house every single month. We know how to help you accelerate to that target if you're not there yet, and let's get started. And so that's where we started with communities. I included this for the data team that's in the room because that Google Sheet dashboard meant that we had separate dashboards for every single community, which meant that anytime we made a change, which we made a lot of them, or I asked for a lot of changes to things, they had to go through and make a new change in every single dashboard. So it was very scrappy at the beginning. The other thing, in addition to the dashboards that we thought would be awesome, is we were creating a movement that was ending homelessness, just not communities ending homelessness. So we created these whiteboards where communities could have them up in their offices, and they could fill in how they were doing as they went, and in addition to that dashboard they were reporting into. And then we thought what would be even better is if we asked them all to take pictures of their leaders holding these dashboards, and had a housing placement target day where simultaneously we posted hundreds of pictures of community leaders all over the country holding up their takedown targets and saying, we are all in, we only have to have this many people to get there in the next year. We even asked Secretary Julian Castro to hold up one of these signs and look at HUD's like, we're right behind you, we're gonna bring the resources you need. Former VA Secretary Bob McDonald's like, we're right behind you, we're gonna get there, we're gonna give it a year, 2 years, we're gonna get there. And so we were working, our team was working to help communities house the number of people they needed to house. As we went, we had to said in the first year, 75 communities would end veteran homelessness. It's a little ambitious. 25 of our communities were hitting their takedown targets, and we were like, it's not 75, but it's 25. We're out of the zone of embarrassment. It'll be okay. Can you guess how many communities actually ended homelessness at the end of the first year? Any guesses?
0.
Better than 0. 1. 1 community. So as the leader of this effort, that I had to be like, we've gotten something fundamentally wrong here. And so this was me, that again, in January of 2016, sitting with the team being like, we got to rethink this. But we got one big thing wrong, which many of you data nerds will probably figure out, which is that we had tried to solve a dynamic problem with static data. That census data was just not telling the stories of what was happening around homelessness across a community. It was a snapshot from one point in time. And even though communities had that data over time, it was not a reliable picture of what was going to happen over the course of a whole year. There are so many dynamics that go on in communities. And so we realized the only way to move forward was to have real-time, person-specific data across a whole geography. And here were the constraints to that. The communities in Built for Zero had raised their hand and signed up to do something that they were not incentivized by money or fame to do, right? They had just said, hey, we'll do this thing. And so there was no funder who was telling them, hey, we'll support you, we'll give you more money to get real-time data. We didn't have any money. We were using Google Sheets, so we had nothing. And so we had to just convince people that this was a good idea after they had been with us for a year and we had really screwed up what we had told them to do. And so that was one constraint. The other constraint is we had national partners and federal partners who were telling us that that idea that you could know who was experiencing homelessness in real time across a whole city, county geography was a crazy idea, that it was futile, it wasn't worth the time and effort, and that we were going to take communities on a crazy ride, that we shouldn't do that. But we really couldn't see any other way to solve that problem. And so we set about with a cohort of community leaders to figure out what would it look like to have quality, real-time, person-specific data across that community on homelessness that you could use to make decisions about strategy and to know if you were making progress. And so we landed with a scorecard that communities started to use that assessed communities in these 4 areas. So 1, were they getting full coverage of the whole community? So everyone on the streets and shelter. Did you have outreach teams that were able to go out everywhere in that community? Were all the places that people experiencing homelessness might show up, were those providers willing to use the same mechanism to collect person-specific information on those individuals and enter it into a shared database and then use that information to drive their decisions? Was the data being collected person level so that we understood the housing and health needs of each individual, but then could aggregate that data to really understand the trends around certain needs across populations and see how those trends would change over time? Could we measure if the data was reliable? So as you saw on the previous slide, we're looking at not only who's homeless right now in front of you, but who's coming into the system, who's exiting the system. Are they coming in because they're completely new to homelessness, or are they coming in because you housed them and they weren't successful, now they're coming back again? So we were really trying to understand those dynamics, but it needs to balance like a checkbook, and that was one of the things we realized quickly, is that that data wasn't balancing. And so we decided reliability and some quality assurance mechanisms needed to be built in from the beginning. And could it be near real time? Could it be updated regularly? And could communities really know when someone got housed or someone left the community? And so all of that became this by name list scorecard that we slowly started to roll out to communities, despite the skepticism. And so that original dashboard that was just focused on housing placements turned into still a Google Sheets dashboard, but one that looked like this, where we were looking at population level data month over month and trying to see if the housing placements that people were reporting were driving any change in that overall population. So as they got faster and better at housing people, were we seeing the population move or not? And if not, what were we going to do differently together? So January 2016, we had 0 communities with real-time data. Today, almost every one of our communities has real-time data on homelessness. And there's a lot of stories in this line graph, which is counting up the number of communities that had real-time data month over month. And a lot of heartache on our team of really learning with communities, what does it take, convincing communities, wondering if it was worth the effort. And I'll say, looking 3 years back, this was the game changer for our communities, but also for our sector. And I don't think we'd be where we are without that. And as all of you know, the data is only as good as how you deploy it. And so I just want to be clear that we often in our sector get criticized for being so focused on data. But the way that you use that information is what actually matters. And so we work with communities to fit that data within a quality improvement framework to really look at what are we trying to accomplish and get clear about how you're measuring that end state, being clear about how we will know when a change is an improvement and what we're going to test. And the data and the analytics communities are doing, they're all helping them understand, are we moving the needle? And if we're not, what's happening in our system and what should we try and what should we test? The shift to real-time data, to quality improvement, also requires a big shift in mindset at the community level. If you go back to our organization working on housing back in the 1990s, 2000s, we were running a program. We had a very successful program that housed people. And if you would have asked me back then, are you ending homelessness? I would have said yes. Look at what we're doing. We have 400 units. The people here, their homelessness is ended. But we had an excellent program that was ending homelessness for the people lucky to come in. But across New York City, homelessness wasn't reducing, it wasn't getting better. And so we had to, as a provider in that community, be prepared to say, even if our program is excellent, if collectively all the investments and all the programs and all the strategies aren't adding up to fewer people experiencing homelessness this month than last month, then we're prepared to do something different collectively and in collaboration with each other. And that's a big shift. Again, there's no incentive to do that in the community level. You don't get more money if you all work together at a population level, right? Really, the incentive is to run excellent programs. And so the communities in Built for Zero deserve a huge amount of credit for being willing to make that shift to system outcomes over program outcomes and collectively hold themselves accountable for that. So where are we? All of that learning and change over time. There are now 85 communities in Built for Zero across the country. Some of yours might also be part of that effort. To date, 11 communities have ended veteran homelessness or chronic homelessness. Almost 114,000 individuals have been housed. And while we don't use that as a measure of how we're doing, we do keep track of it because I think it's really about the people behind this work and the lives being changed by communities working differently. And it takes tremendous work on the ground in these communities to help people move through these systems. And so really making sure we celebrate how many people's lives have been affected by the work that's happening across communities. 44 communities are seeing reductions in homelessness, and that's something that's really important for us to track, because if we're not seeing any of our communities drive reductions, then no one else is going to end homelessness. And so we're really looking at, are people moving the needle, even if it's slowly? Are we seeing progress? As I said, almost all of our communities have real-time data. When a community joins Built for Zero now, it takes on average about 6 months for them to go to quality data across the community. That would be unheard of for me to have said back to you back in January of 2016. People just laughed me out of a room like this if I said that. So to be in a place where I confidently can say, if your community wants to work this way, we can get you there, is some incredible work that the team has done. For you skeptics, here's the data. Here's a community, Gulf Coast, Mississippi, which is actually a 6-county region on the Gulf of Mississippi, one of 3 communities in the country that have ended chronic homelessness. They, every month, keep track. The blue bars are the number of people experiencing chronic homelessness or long-term homelessness in their community. They keep track of that every single month, even after they ended, because ending is just constantly solving. The dynamics in that community are going to change. The economics are going to change. And the real work is, can they hold that for the next decade, for the next generation? Can they hold these gains over time? And can this just really be the way the whole community works now? And so you see that they've held under 3. And even back in May of 2019, when it jumped up to 5, because they have this data, they can be like, wait, something's wrong. We're out of whack. Like, what do we need to be doing differently? And they were able to get that back down again. Our team has grown. We're no longer that scrappy little team. And as we've grown, I think the tools that we've used have changed too. So you'll see at one point the graph started to change into visualizations that were actually from Tableau, because we were able to start knowing what we really needed to be able to go to scale. And now the work of this team, which is really a team of data people who all understand that what we do really is about how we're using data to drive decision making. The work going forward is really how we're going to scale this work outside of the communities that have been the early adopters of a new way of working. So at a high level, what we have learned about what it takes for a community to end homelessness, but honestly, I think this is true of any complex social problem you want to tackle, is that you need a shared measurable aim that is the North Star. I think if we had not done that at the beginning, we could have lost the plot so many times along the way and got distracted with so much work that you could have focused on. But because we knew exactly the needle we were trying to move and how we were measuring it, we were able to stay focused both as a team leading this effort, but also on the ground in communities. On the ground, teams need to be nimble and integrated across multiple sectors and have the ability to move in response to the data, which means having that real-time feedback loop that's person-specific, but then can pull up and be aggregated to look at trends. And that team needs a flexible arsenal of resources. I think in our sector, and this is true of anyone kind of working in this social problem space, often we're asked to apply for resources years ahead of when we'll actually deploy those resources. And it's hard to know exactly what you're going to need to solve a problem that you don't know how to solve yet. And so having resources that you can deploy in response to data has been really critical in the communities we're working with. And then still, people need evidence-based practice. So what works when you have a technical problem? And there is a lot of best practice out in the field. Communities need access to what is the best practice around certain problems. But I think for a long time in our sector, we started with just deploying all the evidence-based practices and hoping those were going to add up to a result, rather than looking at the data and deploying them in response to something, and then looking to see, did it work in our context, and how would we change it for our context going forward? The other big next area for us is how are we going to grow our data culture in our sector? And I know this has been talked a lot at this conference, but right now we have a coalition of willing in Built for Zero, communities who've opted into this really with no incentive to do so other than they're very committed to solving this problem in their communities. They get no money. The community that you saw, Gulf Coast, who's ended homelessness and held that, they don't get more money for doing that, and most people in the country probably don't know that they've done that. And so we have to figure out how do we get more communities to work this way when really there's no incentive to do so. So in full scale, looks like almost over 400, 500 communities in the country working differently. We also have to invest in human capacity and capability. Many teams have one very strong data lead who's kind of holding down the fort and doing their best with the resources they have, just like we were when we were using Google Sheets, but really investing in the professionalizing the data team within our sector and making sure people have the capacity and capability they need to drive this work forward. Access to data tools. So our vision is that every one of our communities has access to Tableau and knows how to use it and can use it to drive decisions in their community, and that they're ambassadors helping to spread innovation quickly through the network as certain communities figure out things. And then lastly, cross-system collaboration, which may be the most challenging of these things, which is people experiencing homelessness don't always stay in the same place. People are often moving between regions and systems. And how does the data start to talk to each other so we can be more effective in how we're learning together and the kind of solutions we're deploying? But there are some bright spots, and I just want to call those out. That's kind of a sign of how effective we can be with some of these tools going forward. Charles Temple, who's the data lead in Jacksonville, Florida, who's here. Charles, would you raise your hand? He's over there. He was able to use Tableau to create this scatter plot to help the team be open to some of the aggregate data that we were seeing around how long it was taking for people to be housed. And so this is looking at, along the bottom, how many days it takes for someone to move from the streets into housing, and on the top, its acuity level, how high needs that individual is. And so people were able to look at the data in this way and get curious about some of the outliers, like what's happening with the blue person up in the corner? Why is their experience, someone who's at very, very high need, so poor right now? And who is that person? What can we learn about how we need to change the system? And I think that the curiosity and ability to see the information and the people behind and the experience they may have has really been powerful in Jacksonville. We hope that they're one of the first large communities to end veteran homelessness in the next 3 to 6 months. And then Matt Richard, which, I don't know, Matt, are you in the room? I'm not sure if he made it. But Matt Richard is the data lead in Denver. And Denver is really starting to look at racial equity in the community. So looking at, are the systems we've designed to end homelessness equitable, or are we, even as we end homelessness, disproportionately allocating housing resources to white people over people of color? And so communities are starting to use the data to lean into system improvement around gender and racial equality. And I think that's a huge step forward for us to really interrogate, even if we have effective systems, are they really effective for everyone? And that's been, this has been a powerful conversation that because of his work, the community has started to lean into. And I put Ed Givens back up just because I think we talk a lot about data, but it's always helpful to go back to the people that we are talking about and what it means when we can figure out how to deploy these resources in the service of just better systems and better communities. And that is something I think we don't talk enough about, which is behind this data there are people, but behind this data there are also communities. And a community that has a very soft spot in my heart is Rockford, Illinois. It's a county just outside of Chicago. Anyone from Rockford? I'd be very happy. Oh, you are, kind of? All right. Awesome. So Rockford, that one community that ended veteran homelessness was Rockford, Illinois. And they also went on to end chronic homelessness in January 2017. So you'll see they not only ended it, but they've sustained that now for almost 3 years, which is incredible work that they've done. And we had the pleasure of getting to know the mayor of Rockford very well during the course of that time. And he tells these incredible stories of, he grew up in Rockford. And when he grew up, the narrative about that community is, you know, the worst place to live, the fattest town in America. It was very negative, the underwater mortgage capital of America. And how that narrative about the place that you live starts to affect how community members think about themselves and the place that they live. And that when he graduated high school, all he wanted to do was get out of Rockford and go as far away as he could. And he did. He went to law school. But the tug of family and community brought him back. And he really embraced in 2017 or 2016, he really embraced using data and quality improvement. And their community, because of that, became the first community in the country to end veteran homelessness and were recognized at the White House. They went on, as I said, to end chronic homelessness in 2017. And we think that they are going to be the first community in the country to end all homelessness across their whole county. And I think what's behind that data is just the story of a community that the narrative is now very different, is they are a community of problem solvers who have the capacity to take on challenges that people think are impossible to solve. And so I think it is very powerful to think about what does it mean to live in a place that ends homelessness, and how does that change what we think about ourselves and the communities where we live. So thank you very much. Love to talk.